The autumn breeze rustled through the trees lining the courthouse steps as Honorable Justice Thompson adjusted her navy blazer and checked her watch. 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. She'd been arriving at this same time for the past 15 years, watching the historic building come alive each morning. The familiar weight of her leather briefcase, passed down from her father who'd also served on the bench, brought a smile to her face as she climbed the worn marble steps. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the courthouse's limestone facade, and the clicking of her sensible heels echoed in the quiet morning air. A few early birds, mostly clerks and paralegals, nodded respectfully as they passed. They all knew the judge's reputation for fairness and wisdom that had earned her numerous accolades, including being named the state's Outstanding Jurist of the Year. Inside her briefcase, she carried the files for today's cases: 3 sentencing hearings and a complex property dispute that had been making headlines in the local papers. But more than just papers and legal documents, she carried the weight of responsibility that came with her position. Each decision she made affected real lives, real families, and she never took that lightly. As she approached the employee entrance, she noticed the usual security guard wasn't at his post. Instead, an unfamiliar face manned the checkpoint. That's when her ordinary morning began to shift into something unexpected. She could feel it in the air, a tension that wasn't usually present in these quiet morning hours. The judge pulled out her credentials, the same way she had thousands of times before. The laminated ID card showed her in her judicial robes, her expression stern but fair, the same expression that had presided over countless cases, from petty theft to capital crimes. She'd earned every gray hair that decorated her temples, each one representing lessons learned about human nature and justice. The morning light streamed through the high windows, creating long shadows that stretched across the polished floor. The smell of coffee wafted from the direction of the clerk's office, mixing with the familiar scent of old books and furniture polish that always reminded her of her first day on the bench. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt off. A young intern hurried past, arms full of case files, offering a quick, "Good morning, Your Honor." The judge returned the greeting with a warm smile, remembering her own days as a fresh-faced law clerk. That's what she loved about this job, watching young legal minds grow, helping shape the next generation of justice servants. She could hear the distant sound of the maintenance crew preparing the courtrooms for the day ahead. The gentle hum of the building's air conditioning system kicked in, and somewhere a phone began to ring. Just another morning at the courthouse, or so she thought. As she reached for her ID card, the judge mentally reviewed her morning schedule. First up would be the status conference for the Thompson case, followed by 2 motion hearings. She'd already reviewed all the briefs, making careful notes in her precise handwriting. Everything was in order, just as she liked it. Little did she know that in the next few moments, everything about this routine morning would change. The security guard's expression shifted as she approached, and suddenly, 15 years of respect and authority were about to be tested in ways she never expected. Officer Wright stood at the security checkpoint, his 20 years on the job evident in the deep lines around his eyes and the slight gray at his temples. He transferred from another courthouse just last week, and already his presence had created ripples of discomfort among the regular staff. Something about the way he carried himself, the way his eyes followed certain people more than others, made folks uneasy. The judge approached the employee entrance, her credentials displayed as always. The morning light caught the gold embossing on her ID badge, clearly showing her title and position. But Officer Wright's reaction wasn't the usual respectful nod she'd grown accustomed to over her years on the bench. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see additional identification," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that drew the attention of nearby courthouse employees. His hand rested near his utility belt, a gesture that seemed unnecessarily aggressive for a routine security check. The judge maintained her composure, years of courtroom experience evident in her steady voice. "Officer, I've provided my judicial credentials. Is there a specific reason you need additional verification?" She kept her tone professional, though she couldn't help but notice how differently he was treating other employees passing through the checkpoint. A young law clerk walking by slowed her pace. Coffee cup paused halfway to her lips as she witnessed the scene unfolding. Two other security officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing their colleagues' inappropriate behavior but unsure how to intervene. "I don't care what that badge says." Officer Wright's voice grew louder, drawing more attention. "For all I know, it could be fake. You'll need to step aside and wait while I verify your identity." His hand now fully rested on his weapon, a clear escalation that sent ripples of tension through the growing crowd of onlookers. The judge took a deep breath, her mind racing through years of similar encounters, not in her judicial robes, but in everyday life. She'd faced this before, but never here, never in her own courthouse where she'd served justice for 15 years. A senior clerk stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly but determined. "Officer Wright, this is Judge Thompson. She's presided here for over a decade. I can personally vouch." But Wright cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Sir, step back. This is a security matter." Wright's face had grown red, his authority challenged in front of the morning crowd. More phones appeared in hands around the lobby, their cameras capturing what everyone could see was a glaring abuse of power. The judge stood perfectly still, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp and observant. She'd seen this type of behavior in her courtroom countless times. People letting their prejudices override their professional duties. But she hadn't expected to experience it firsthand, not here in these halls of justice. The morning sun continued to stream through the high windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The usual bustle of courthouse activity had gone silent, everyone watching this moment of truth unfold. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the slight jingling of Officer Wright's equipment as he shifted his stance. "Officer," the judge spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of her years on the bench, "I understand you're new here. But your current actions are being recorded by multiple witnesses, and I want you to think very carefully about your next move." She didn't raise her voice or show anger. She didn't need to. The power of truth and justice rang in every word. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. This wasn't just about one morning or one security check anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that would change the courthouse forever. Time seemed to slow down in the courthouse lobby as the confrontation reached a new level. The judge's calm question of Officer Wright's unusual demands had triggered something in him. His face flushed darker, and his hand gripped his weapon more firmly. The morning light streaming through the windows cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the anger in his expression. "You're being uncooperative," he snapped, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "Step away from the security checkpoint immediately." His words carried a threat that made everyone in the lobby hold their breath. The other security officers nearby shifted uncomfortably, their experience telling them this was wrong, but their hesitation to challenge a fellow officer holding them back. A court reporter who'd worked with the judge for years slowly reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she started recording. She'd seen the judge handle the most difficult cases with grace and wisdom, but this was different. This was personal, and everyone could feel it. The judge remained perfectly still, her years of courtroom experience evident in her steady gaze. "Officer Wright," she said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used when addressing contempt in her courtroom. "I want you to think very carefully about what's happening right now. Look around you." And indeed, the scene around them had transformed. More courthouse employees had gathered, their faces showing a mix of shock and concern. Phones recorded from every angle, capturing each word, each movement. The young law clerk from earlier had disappeared, running toward the chief judge's chambers. Officer Wright's radio crackled with concerned voices from other security stations, but he ignored them. His breathing had become heavy, visible in the way his chest rose and fell rapidly. "You don't give me orders," he growled, forgetting or choosing to ignore her position. I give the orders at this checkpoint. The judge's handbag still hung perfectly steady on her shoulder, her posture unchanged. Years of facing down much more dangerous situations in her courtroom had taught her the power of remaining calm. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She could see the fear in the eyes of the young black intern watching from near the water fountain, could feel the weight of what this moment meant for everyone who would come after her. Every second of this interaction is being recorded, she stated simply, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent lobby. Every person here is a witness. And right now, you have a choice to make about how this ends. 2 more security officers had arrived from the upper floors, drawn by the commotion. They assessed the situation quickly, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern as they realized what was unfolding. One of them, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair, took a step forward, his hand raised in a calming gesture. But Officer Wright was too far gone in his power play to notice. "Turn around and place your hands where I can see them," he demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. The absurdity of his demand, asking a respected judge to assume a position of arrest in her own courthouse, sent whispers of disbelief through the gathered crowd. The judge didn't move. Her eyes remained locked with Wright's, her expression one of composed determination. She'd spent her career ensuring justice was served in these halls, and she wasn't about to let this moment pass without serving as an example of dignity under pressure. The tension in the air had become almost unbearable. The gentle whoosh of the air conditioning seemed thunderous in the silence. Outside, the morning sun continued its climb, unaware of the drama unfolding within these walls of justice. Something had to give, and everyone knew the next few moments would determine exactly how this story would be told in the years to come. The security cameras whirred silently overhead, their red lights blinking as they captured every second of the unfolding scene. One was positioned directly above the checkpoint, its lens focused on Officer Wright as he physically moved to block the judge's path. Another camera had a perfect view of the growing crowd of courthouse employees, their faces showing mixtures of disbelief and concern. "I said you're not entering this building," Officer Wright declared, his voice growing louder with each word. His hand was now fully gripping his weapon, knuckles white with tension. The morning light caught his name badge, making it gleam as his chest heaved with agitation. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool air conditioning. The judge stood her ground, her credentials still held out in front of her like a shield of truth. She'd faced down hardened criminals in her courtroom, but this was different. This was a man sworn to protect and serve, now becoming the very threat he was supposed to prevent. "Get back up down here now," Wright barked into his radio, his voice cracking slightly. "We have an unauthorized individual attempting to breach security." The absurdity of his words hung in the air, calling for backup against a judge everyone knew, in her own courthouse, where she'd served for 15 years. A young probation officer who'd appeared in the judge's courtroom just yesterday stepped forward, phone steady in his hand as he recorded. "Officer, that's Judge." But the judge raised her hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. She knew this moment needed to play out, needed to be documented in its entirety. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the lobby floor. More courthouse staff had arrived for the day, each stopping in shock at the scene before them. The usual morning chatter had been replaced by tense silence, broken only by the sound of Officer Wright's increasingly agitated breathing and the soft beep of phones recording. "Last warning," Wright growled, his face now flushed deep red. "Step back from the checkpoint, or I'll be forced to take action." His threat hung in the air like a heavy cloud, making several onlookers gasp. 2 other security officers had finally started moving toward the scene, recognizing that their colleague had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The judge remained perfectly still, her expression calm but firm. Years of maintaining order in her courtroom had taught her the power of silence, of letting tension reveal truth. Her briefcase still hung steady in her hand, containing the day's cases that needed her attention. Justice delayed by prejudice wearing a badge. Through the front windows, people on the courthouse steps had begun to notice the commotion inside. Some pressed their faces against the glass, phones out, adding to the growing number of witnesses. A court clerk who'd worked with the judge for over a decade had tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth in horror at what she was seeing. The judge's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the weight of every similar incident that had ever happened in these halls of justice. "Officer Wright," she said, each word clear and measured, "I want the record to show that at this moment, you are preventing a sitting judge from entering her courthouse, while threatening physical force, all of which is being recorded from multiple angles." Time seemed to stand still in that moment. The gentle hum of the building's heating system seemed thunderous in the silence. Officer Wright's radio crackled with voices he continued to ignore, his judgment clouded by something deeper than mere misunderstanding. This was no longer just about entering a building. It had become a moment that would force everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and prejudice. The first person to step forward was a young clerk who'd only been working at the courthouse for 3 months. Her hands shook as she held up her phone, but her voice was steady. "I've been watching Officer Wright since he started here last week," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's been stopping every person of color, demanding extra ID, but letting everyone else through with just a nod." Her words broke the dam of silence. A public defender who'd watched the whole scene unfold stepped up next, his phone also recording. "I saw him do the same thing to my client's family yesterday. Made them wait 20 minutes for extra security checks while other people walked right in." The lobby had become crowded now, with courthouse staff forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Officer Wright's face had lost some of its redness, replaced by a growing pallor as he realized how many witnesses were speaking up, how many cameras were recording his actions. A senior bailiff, who'd served in the courthouse for over 2 decades, moved closer to the scene. "In all my years here," he announced, his deep voice carrying authority, "I've never seen any security officer treat a judge this way. But I've been hearing stories about Officer Wright's behavior since his first day." More voices joined in, each one adding to the growing testimony. A court interpreter described how Wright had made her show 3 forms of ID the day before, despite her wearing her official courthouse badge. A law student intern revealed how he'd overheard Wright making discriminatory comments during lunch break. The judge remained silent, letting each person speak their truth. She'd spent years listening to testimony in her courtroom, and now the roles were reversed. She was the center of a case being built by a chorus of witnesses, each one brave enough to stand up and be counted. Through the windows, the morning sun illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Officer Wright's radio kept crackling with increasingly urgent messages from his supervisors, but he seemed frozen in place, his hand still resting on his weapon, though his grip had loosened. A veteran court reporter, her fingers usually flying across her stenotype machine, now held up her phone steadily. "I've got it all recorded," she announced. "Every word, every action, from the moment he first stopped you, Your Honor. And I'm sending copies to the Chief Judge's office right now." The young clerk who'd spoken first had tears in her eyes, but her voice grew stronger. "I was afraid to say anything before," she admitted. "I thought maybe I was imagining things, or that nobody would believe me. But watching him do this to a judge, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." The crowd had grown to include lawyers, defendants' families, and even a few jurors who'd arrived early for their duty. Each new arrival was quickly filled in by whispers, the story spreading through the courthouse like ripples in a pond. Phones continued recording, documenting not just the confrontation, but the remarkable response of an entire courthouse community coming together. Officer Wright's fellow security officers had moved closer now, their faces showing a mix of shame and determination. They'd worked alongside him for only a week, but they'd seen enough. One of them reached for his radio, speaking clearly into it. "Chief, We need you down here now. And bring HR. We've got multiple witnesses to a serious situation. The morning light streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes in its beams, making the scene seem almost surreal. But this was very real. A moment of truth where silence was replaced by solidarity, where fear gave way to courage, and where justice was being served not in a courtroom, but in the very halls that led to it. The crowd parted as the chief judge rushed into the lobby, followed closely by the head of courthouse security. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Everyone expected the judge to demand Officer Wright's immediate dismissal. It would have been her right after what had just happened. Instead, she did something that left everyone speechless. "Before we do anything else," the judge said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in her most important rulings, "I want to be clear about what this moment means for all of us." She looked around the lobby, making eye contact with each person present. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to soften, as if nature itself was listening. "Officer Wright isn't the only one who needs to be in this conversation," she continued, straightening her blazer with dignity. "What happened here today is about more than one incident or one person. It's about patterns we've all seen, but maybe felt powerless to address." The chief judge stood quietly, his usual authoritative presence yielding to her wisdom. The head of security had pulled out a notepad, realizing this was going to be more than a simple disciplinary matter. Officer Wright remained frozen in place, his hand finally dropped from his weapon, his face a mix of confusion and shame. "I'm requesting an emergency meeting," the judge announced, "not to punish, but to change. Every person who spoke up today should be there. Every person who's experienced similar treatment should be heard. And yes," she looked directly at Officer Wright, "you should be there too, if you're willing to listen and learn." A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone expected. The young clerk who'd first spoken up wiped tears from her eyes, understanding the power of what was happening. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. "Your Honor," the head of security started, "we can have him removed from duty immediately." The judge raised her hand gently. "Removing one officer doesn't solve the larger issue," she said. "We need new protocols, better training, and most importantly, we need to create an environment where people feel safe speaking up before things reach this point." The morning sun had fully risen now, filling the lobby with warm light. Someone's phone buzzed in the silence, but nobody moved to check it. They were all witnessing something remarkable. A moment when justice wasn't just being served, but being transformed. "I want a complete review of our security procedures," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want every complaint that's been pushed aside or ignored brought to light. And I want everyone in this building, from judges to janitors, to be part of creating the solution." The chief judge nodded slowly, a look of respect and understanding crossing his face. The head of security was writing frantically in his notepad, already seeing the scope of changes ahead. Officer Wright's shoulders had slumped, the fight gone out of him as he began to understand the true meaning of authority. "This isn't about shame or blame," the judge said, looking around the lobby one more time. "It's about growth. It's about making sure that every person who walks through these doors, whether they're a judge or a defendant's family member, is treated with the same respect we'd want for ourselves." The crowd stayed silent, but their faces showed something new: hope. This wasn't the end of a confrontation anymore. It was the beginning of a change. The young law clerk who'd run to get help was now typing frantically on her phone, documenting every word. She knew she was witnessing something that would be talked about in law schools for years to come. The weight of the moment settled over the courthouse lobby like a gentle blanket. What could have been just another viral video of confrontation was becoming something else entirely. A masterclass in true leadership and the real meaning of justice. By noon, the morning's events had spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Local news vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Inside, the usual buzz of courthouse activity had a different energy. People talked in hushed tones, sharing their own experiences, finally feeling brave enough to speak up. The judge sat in her chambers, reading through emails that poured in from colleagues across the country. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from other judges, lawyers, and court workers, all wanting to know more about her approach to handling the situation. But she wasn't interested in becoming a viral sensation or media star. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was the young clerk who'd first spoken up that morning. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steadier now than it had been earlier, "the local news wants to interview you. They're calling it a shocking confrontation and courthouse chaos." She held up her phone, showing headlines that were already spreading across social media. The judge shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Let's give them something better to report," she said, standing up from her desk. "Call the Chief Judge's office. Tell them I'm ready to announce our new security training initiative, and make sure Officer Wright is invited to be part of the press conference." Down in the lobby, the morning's video had already been viewed thousands of times. But unlike many viral videos of confrontation, this one showed something different. It showed resolution, wisdom, and the possibility of change. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own courthouse experiences, both good and bad. The head of courthouse security had spent the morning in emergency meetings, his notepad now full of action items. "We're not just changing protocols," he announced to his team. "We're changing our entire approach to public service." As officers nodded, many of them still processing how close they'd come to a much worse outcome. Officer Wright sat alone in the break room, his uniform jacket hanging loose, his face showing the weight of his actions. A senior officer brought him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "You've got a choice to make," the older officer said quietly. "You can let this end your career, or you can help make sure it never happens to anyone else." The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with conversation. Court staff who'd worked together for years found themselves having deeper discussions about experiences they'd never shared before. A probation officer mentioned the times even stopped entering his own office building. A senior lawyer recalled similar incidents from her early career. By mid-afternoon, the judge's office had drafted a comprehensive proposal for change. It wasn't just about security training. It included town hall meetings where community members could share their experiences, regular reviews of security footage to identify patterns of behavior, and a new system for reporting and addressing concerns. The local paper's court reporter sat in the press room, typing furiously. She'd covered hundreds of stories in this courthouse, but this was different. "Judge turns confrontation into catalyst for change," her headline read. Below it, she wrote about how one morning's incident had opened the door to addressing years of unspoken concerns. Outside the judge's chambers, a small group of court employees gathered, sharing stories and ideas. The young clerk who'd spoken up first sat among them, no longer afraid to use her voice. "You know what's amazing?" she said to the group. "This morning, I was terrified to speak up. Now I feel like we're finally being heard." The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. In courtroom after courtroom, as regular sessions resumed, something had shifted. It wasn't just about one judge or one officer anymore. It was about a community finding its voice, about justice taking on a deeper meaning in the very place where it was supposed to live. The weeks that followed brought changes nobody could have predicted that tense morning. The courthouse halls buzzed with activity, but it wasn't just the usual business of justice. It was the sound of transformation. Training sessions filled every available conference room, with security officers and court staff learning together about unconscious bias and cultural awareness. Officer Wright surprised everyone by becoming one of the most committed participants. He sat in the front row of every session, taking notes, asking questions, and most importantly, listening. "I never saw myself clearly before," he admitted during one session, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was just doing my job, but now I understand how my actions affected people." The judge's initiative had grown beyond simple security protocols. Every Thursday afternoon, the largest courtroom transformed into a community forum. People from all walks of life shared their experiences, good and bad, about interactions with the justice system. The young clerk who'd first spoken up now helped organize these sessions, her initial fear replaced by a sense of purpose. Remember that morning? One bailiff said to another as they watched people file in for a training session. I thought we were heading for disaster. Instead, look at what's happening. He gestured to the room where Officer Wright was helping set up chairs, chatting easily with the court interpreter he once treated with suspicion. The head of security had pinned a new mission statement on every bulletin board. Justice begins at the door. Below it, a simple system for reporting concerns replaced the complicated old process that had buried problems instead of solving them. We've had more honest conversations in the past few weeks than in my entire career, he told his team during a morning briefing. In the judge's chambers, a growing collection of letters filled a drawer, not just from local residents, but from courthouses across the country asking for advice on implementing similar changes. She answered each one personally, sharing not just procedures but the philosophy behind them. Real change happens when we see each other as human beings first. The courthouse coffee shop became an unlikely center for transformation. People who'd worked in the same building for years but never really talked now shared tables and stories. A defense attorney mentioned to a security officer how his client's mother had been afraid to come to court. Instead of getting defensive, the officer asked more questions, really listening to understand. The young law student who'd recorded the original incident was now working on his thesis about institutional change. It's not just about what happened that day, he explained to his professor. It's about what happened next. How one person's response to injustice created a ripple effect of positive change. Even the physical space began to transform. The security checkpoint, once a place of tension, now displayed a welcome sign in multiple languages. Officers greeted visitors with respect, took time to explain procedures, and made sure everyone understood their rights. The morning lines moved more smoothly, not because security was less thorough, but because it was more human. Officer Wright's biggest test came when the judge who he confronted joined his training group one afternoon. The room fell silent, everyone watching to see what would happen. But the judge simply sat down beside him, opened her notebook, and said, "We're all here to learn." That moment, more than any policy change, showed everyone what real leadership looked like. Local schools started bringing students to observe the new training sessions. This is what justice looks like, a teacher told her civics class. It's not just about laws and procedures, it's about people working together to make things better. The students watched as courthouse staff and officers role-played scenarios, practiced de-escalation techniques, and discussed how to handle difficult situations with dignity. 6 months had passed since that tense morning at the security checkpoint. The courthouse had become a different place, not just in its procedures, but in its spirit. On this particular morning, the judge paused at the top of the courthouse steps, watching the sunrise just like she had that day. But now, everything was different. At the security checkpoint, Officer Wright stood tall in his uniform, greeting each person with genuine respect. The same young clerk who'd first spoken up against him now passed through with a smile, the two of them chatting briefly about the upcoming community forum. "We've got 20 new people signed up to share their stories," she told him, her voice full of enthusiasm. Inside, the lobby walls displayed photographs from training sessions, community meetings, and celebration events. Each image told a story of change. Security officers and community members working together, staff members leading workshops, and people from all walks of life finding common ground in these halls of justice. "You should see what's happening in other courthouses," the chief judge said during the morning staff meeting. "They're using our program as a model." He held up a National Justice magazine with their courthouse on the cover. The headline read, "From Confrontation to Transformation: How One Incident Changed the Face of Justice." The judge who'd faced discrimination that morning now led a monthly roundtable discussion where courthouse staff could openly share their experiences and concerns. The real victory, she often said, isn't just in changing policies. It's in changing hearts and minds. Her words had become a motto of sorts, printed on cards that every new employee received. In the security office, a wall of testimonials grew longer each week. "First time I've felt truly welcome in a courthouse," read one note. "The officers treated my grandmother with such respect," said another. Officer Wright often stood there during his breaks, reading the messages, remembering how close he'd come to choosing a very different path. The courthouse had become a place where school groups regularly visited, not just to learn about law, but to see what real change looked like in action. This is what happens when people choose understanding over anger, a teacher told her students as they watched a training session. This is how you turn a problem into progress. Community leaders from other cities came to observe and learn. They sat in on security briefings, attended public forums, and met with staff members who'd been part of the transformation. The most impressive thing, one visitor noted, is how natural it all feels now. This isn't just for show, it's real change. The young law student who'd recorded the original incident had graduated and now worked as a clerk in the building. "Sometimes I watch the old video," he told a colleague, "just to remind myself how far we've come. But more importantly, to remember that change is always possible if we're brave enough to make it happen." On this morning, like every morning now, people of all backgrounds moved through security with ease. Officers knew how to handle cultural differences with respect, how to de-escalate tense situations, and most importantly, how to see the humanity in everyone who walked through those doors. The judge's original vision had grown into something bigger than anyone expected. What could have been just another viral video of confrontation had instead become a blueprint for institutional change. The courthouse wasn't just a place where justice was served. It was a place where justice was lived, where every person's dignity was honored, and where the true meaning of public service was demonstrated every day. As the morning sun filled the lobby with warm light, the judge watched Officer Wright help an elderly woman through security, treating her with the kind of gentle respect that had become his trademark. Their eyes met briefly across the lobby, and they shared a small nod, two people who turned a moment of conflict into a lifetime of positive change.